Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bold, Beautiful Borderline podcast. It's your host, Sarah, and today I have Dr. Kiki Fehling, not Felling, here, like failing in class, here to talk with us about CPTSD. And we were just both saying how we feel a little like nervous about this topic because there's so many big feelings about it, especially on social media. And I have to be honest, I like clinically don't know a whole lot about it. Because it's not something that we diagnose yet, anyways. And so we're here to talk about kind of like what CPTSD is, how it shows up, how it's different from PTSD, borderline, all of those things. So, Kiki, tell me like your thoughts about this.
Yeah, so I love the intro you just did because I do want to put some caveats out here because when I talk about CPTSD on TikTok and the like, it's one of the things where I often get the most feedback from people kind of being upset about the way that I have phrased things. And so I want to like couch this entire conversation in I'm coming from a really specific lens. So exactly like you said, I also don't diagnose CPTSD because of my specific clinical training, because I practice in America where we use the DSM-5, where CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis is not yet in the manual, but the ICD-11, which is the manual used in a lot of the rest of the world, does have a CPTSD diagnosis, but I don't use that, so I don't diagnose it. Also, from my understanding of the research and like conceptualization of this disorder in the field thus far, I don't know if like the diagnosis of CPTSD compared to PTSD is as important when I treat a client. So I'm sure I'll talk a lot more about that in the future, but as long as it sounds good to you, I'm also thinking it probably helps to start with like a definition of what these things are a little bit. Okay. Um, so I am sure that a lot of listeners in your podcast are familiar with maybe all three of these terms, but at least PTSD and BPD. So let me just start by saying because complex PTSD, CPTSD, is in the ICD-11, I'm going to start there. So in the ICD-11, for example, PTSD only has three diagnostic criteria, from my understanding. So now I'm going to read this to make sure I get this right. So PTSD is not complex in the ICD-11, only requires that you have one thing, what we call re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks or kind of memories of the trauma. Two, that you avoid thinking about the trauma or you avoid things that remind you about the trauma, so avoidance. And then three, persistent, heightened current threat. So this is things like heightened startle response or like intense anxiety and physical agitation. So in the ICD-11, those are the only three things required for a PTSD diagnosis, which is pretty notable compared to the DSM-5. So it's just like I've experienced a trauma. I get lost in thoughts about the trauma. I try to avoid thinking about the trauma. And then I have a lot of like physiological stress. So,
Can I also add
yes.
that one of the problems with the PTSD diagnosis is it's very specific in what they define trauma as. So they define trauma
Yes.
as like a literal threat to your life, sexual trauma, physical abuse, or witnessing another person's trauma. And it leaves out things like chronic bullying or like emotional abuse or those kinds of things. And so that can get really messy as well.
I'm really glad you brought that up because that was one of the things that led some of the early thinkers and creators of CPTSD. One of the biggest names that will come up when you read about CPTSD is Judith Herman, I believe, who really talks about exactly that. People who have experienced repeated chronic trauma, particularly in the context of maybe bullying or child abuse, or people, even adults, not necessarily children, who live in like war zones or are facing repeated trauma that may or may not fit the typical explanation or definition of like life threatening. Although obviously war zone and child abuse can often be life threatening. So not to diminish those experiences. And early thinkers of CPTSD viewed that as being one of the main differences between typical PTSD and CPTSD, of like that repeated trauma exposure led to different types of symptoms. So now, ICD 11 definition of complex PTSD beyond requiring like a kind of repeated trauma type of exposure adds on to the typical PTSD diagnosis. Gonna read this again, just again to make sure I get it right, is those same three things of the re-experiencing symptoms, the avoidance, and the heightened physiological arousal, but then also having specific difficulties with emotion regulation, kind of like broadly defined, beliefs about oneself as being like less than or defeated or worthlessness. So a lot of feelings of shame and guilt or failure, even specifically related to the trauma. And then difficulties in sustaining relationships and feeling close to other people. So already for folks who have BPD or who are familiar with the BPD diagnosis, you're going to hear some overlap there of like really significant difficulties with emotions and really significant difficulties with sense of self and really significant difficulties with relationships. So mainly the differences between complex PTSD and BPD is in the way that those symptoms show up, but then also that someone has specifically experienced trauma or not, and then have trauma specific symptoms like that re-experiencing or avoidance. And so, again, this is where it gets really difficult because so many people with BPD have trauma. Like we've known from the beginning of treatment trials of trying to help people with BPD that huge proportions of them also meet criteria for PTSD. And so then when you bring in, and a lot of them have experienced repeated childhood sexual and emotional trauma. And so I mean, that's often even a part of the biosocial model of BPD, right? And so already we're having a huge overlap in CPTSD and BPD symptoms. And then the diagnostic criteria. So this is where one of the difficulties come in. There's so many different directions I could go in right now, but I'll just pause. And like now that I've told you like these criteria, any thoughts or what do you like? It's kind of obvious about how these overlap when you read them like that.
Yeah, and this may not be a well-received thought, so I just want to say that I'm not saying this to be invalidating to anyone's experience, but I think it's a lot more socially appropriate to say I have CPTSD than I have borderline. And so a lot of clinicians might be diagnosing CPTSD or saying CPTSD, diagnosing in other countries, when really a person might be experiencing borderline, but that's so stigmatized that they don't want to give that label. Or like it's easier as a person living with these things to say I have CPTSD than I have borderline because of the stigma.
Mhm.
That's not to say that they can't be experiencing both at the same time, but I do just want to like put that out into the world that like you don't have to be afraid to have borderline. Like you might have both, again, totally okay and normal, but you don't have to be afraid to have borderline.
I am so glad you said that right away because that's one of the things I bring into the conversation as soon as I can when I talk about this of I do also get the feeling, and it's completely understandable that a lot of the pull for folks towards CPTSD is inherent in the diagnosis. It feels like it's less pathologizing of me and more like recognizing of I experienced fucked up things, right? And the way that BPD has been diagnosed, talked about, even treated historically in psychiatry has not been that kind of understanding, trauma-informed conceptualization. And so I think both from the clinician standpoint and the patient person standpoint, it's a really real stigma, external and internalized, that to like need to kind of work with and decide like what diagnosis is more appropriate. So yeah, I think we could spend a whole conversation talking about BPD as a diagnosis and like how we feel about borderline as a term. And I know lots of people have lots of different opinions about that, but I'm with you of it is okay, obviously, to have BPD. Like it is okay to be diagnosed with that. It is possible to have both diagnoses. And right now, it's really, really limited. But the research suggests that understanding and differentiating between these two diagnoses is actually pretty important. So, because I've also heard on social media more so people making the argument that they are the same thing, that it doesn't matter. So people can use the term that they want to use. But in my experience, and then based on some of the research that exists, that isn't quite true. And so, specifically, even though the overlap is very large, there are people with BPD who, at least when you ask them, deny having experienced notable trauma, right? That deny PTSD symptoms in particular. So again, those like re-experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, etc., and like avoidance of trauma. Like maybe we could call chronic invalidation, which most people with BPD would report as trauma in some way. And so then that's where it gets hazy too. But we're still not going to treat, not always, but some forms of chronic invalidation as like with PTSD treatment. That isn't going to be as useful as some of the other types of treatments that we know work for BPD, for example. But if someone does have PTSD symptoms, if they are having re-experiencing and avoidance symptoms, whether or not they have BPD, we want to treat that trauma. Like, so then for me, the difference between whether it's CPTSD or PTSD might not matter as much functionally in the therapy room. If a person resonates with the CPTSD diagnosis or the CPTSD community, like I'm not going to take that from them, definitely not. But then as me and as a clinician in the room, I'm probably going to treat it almost exactly the same, whether I'm conceptualizing it as PTSD or CPTSD. And the reason I say that so confidently now is because over the past maybe 15 years, maybe 10 years, there's been more research to show that the typical standard treatments for PTSD work for people with CPTSD as well. So in the original, going back decades again, to Judith Herman and some of the other people who think about this diagnosis originally, there used to be conceptualization. This even happened in DBT for folks, dialectical behavior therapy, for folks struggling with BPD and PTSD. There was this idea that you couldn't treat PTSD early in the therapy without some like basic stabilization. And for some people, that is like people with BPD who are struggling with severe self-harm, that's still true. We want to make sure that people have skills on board to help them tolerate the emotional distress that comes with trauma treatment in order to then engage in the trauma treatment. But the conceptualization decades ago was that treatment needed to be like quite long and quite staged and give people lots of time to get ready for trauma treatment. And then more recent research shows that might not actually be like necessary. Some people it will be needed, and we should absolutely follow like the client's desires and needs in therapy to go as slow as they want. But other people don't necessarily need the stage treatment. They can go right into PTSD treatment, whether or not they have chronic trauma or like that single trauma, whether or not they have CPTSD or PTSD. So I don't know. I'll pause there and see if you have any reactions or questions to that.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely one of those people that subscribes to it's beneficial to go into treatment for trauma, whether that's EMDR or some other form of trauma-specific treatment with a set of skills for emotion regulation. I
Hmm.
I adhere to that model. I know that's
Hmm.
definitely true for me as someone who's chronically engaged in self-harm. I think that's especially for me. But like people don't often talk about the way in which trauma treatment can be very destabilizing at first. And so
Totally.
having that skill set of tools in your toolbox can be really beneficial to prevent that destabilization.
I do think that's true for the record. And I would say, in my experience, also, like, again, that's not so much based on what trauma you've experienced, more as like where you're at right now and all of the other parts of your development that you've, and like history that you've experienced. So someone may have one trauma and therefore not be possibly diagnosed with CPTSD and need a lot of care and stabilization before beginning a trauma treatment. So again, it doesn't seem based on the research and then in I don't know how you if you've experienced this too, but in my private practice, it's not the trauma itself that indicates what kind of trauma treatment is needed or will be most effective. Okay, you're nodding, so that kind of resonates with you as well. Yeah, man. So maybe what I will say here, I guess just like come back to a caveat for listeners who are now like, I don't know, feeling the feelings about any of the things we're saying. One of the biggest caveats, as I've mentioned, like research has shown this or research says this, is the trickiest part of this area, in my opinion, is that research is quite limited because it hasn't been in the DSM, the DSM, that CPTSD hasn't been in the DSM because so much of the research, like in academic medical centers, for example, require that we use the criteria of the DSM to then like define who is in our study criteria and like study pool that we're treating and studying this stuff in. And so when CPTSD hasn't existed as a diagnosis to even like have consistent language around until the ICD-11, research has been super limited. And people have still studied it in terms of saying, okay, PTSD, but with like repeated childhood trauma specifically as a criteria to try to get at this idea that some like that is a specific group that we're trying to help. So all of that research that's now finally actually able to look at the diagnosis isn't until the past decade or whatever it's been. So, you know, even when I was in grad school, a little over a decade ago now, I wrote a paper on this topic, and some of the things changed from then until now. Like now I view it differently. Of back then, it was less clear that actually there was a difference at all between CPTSD and BPD, that actually they were the same thing. But now there's been research to show actually not so much. When you take these groups of people and have them do the same types of like clinical interviews and questionnaires, you come up with showing that borderline personality disorder folks are more likely to have higher levels of impulsivity and self-harm, which makes sense because self-harm is in the criteria for BPD sometimes, but it's not for CPTSD. Folks with BPD are more likely to have unstable, shifting, or changing a sense of self, like difficulties understanding who they are at all, while folks with CPTSD are more likely to struggle with like shame and persistent negative sense of self. So that's a difference. And then the relationship difficulties are more likely to look differently in the different groups of people again. So folks with BPD are likely to have difficulties with relationships that are like the volatile up and down, like idolizing and villainizing type of like frantic, trying to avoid abandonment specifically, like the BPD symptoms we know. While CPTSD relationship difficulties are more likely to be disconnection in general, like lack of relationships or fear of relationships, like avoidance of intimacy. And so this is where it gets tricky because there's plenty of people with BPD who have chronic shame, right? Or who avoid relationships because of fear of abandonment or something like that. And vice versa. There's plenty of people with CPTSD who self-harm. So one thing by itself isn't going to be like the thing that lets you know what diagnosis is more appropriate for a person. And again, so many people can have both diagnoses, both like kind of constellations of difficulties. And so again, for me, as a clinician, we need more research. We need to understand this better. But at this point, we know they are different things and that it does inform treatment, BPD versus CPTSD. But CPTSD versus PTSD, if we without BPD, we know less about right now about whether there needs to be a difference in treatment. Yeah, does that make sense to you or what you know about these things now, what you've seen in clinical practice or what you've experienced, I guess?
Yeah, it does. And as you were talking about the difference in symptoms, I was like, yep, yep, yep. Like
Mm,
I'm like remembering this because I've, learned about it, but haven't done a ton of research about it. But one of the things that I do as a clinician is we pull out the DSM And
Hmm.
we meaning myself and my client, go through the criteria of any diagnosis I think might potentially fit for that person. And we kind of like walk through diagnosis together. It's really important for me that I never put something in someone's medical record that they're not aware of, and that they might not it's important to me that they sort of like agree with the diagnosis. That's not true for all of my clients. But like if it was me, I would be going down the criteria for borderline and the criteria for CPTSD, even if I'm not going to diagnose that. And we talk about it
Hmm.
together. Like, what do you think is, do you think that it's the volatile up and down in your relationships? Or do you think it's like fear? I don't feel like I can trust anybody because of the trauma that I've been through. Like, how do we differentiate between that two? It's through talking through it.
Yes, yes. And so I think I love that you do that. Um, as I think you know, I'm not currently practicing, so I can't say I do that too, but in the past I've tried to do that. Because to me, I'm aware of even diagnoses beyond BPD having so much stigma. And it's so important for someone, like you said, not to like have a surprise in the medical record, but also just to like understand what this diagnosis means in non-judgmental, compassionate terms. And can we help them understand, like, I don't know if you've had these conversations too, but even like the DSM inherently being problematic, right? So can we just accept like this exists and this is a framework that is the framework we're working in right now and can be really helpful in helping you get treatment that you need, helping you get resources that you need, helping you connect to community, and recognizing its limitations. So, can we use the criteria as just a place to start also so that I can understand your difficulties and you can understand your difficulties and maybe even feel validated by the fact that they're written right here. Like lots of people experience this together enough that they have been created into a diagnosis, right? And then through that conversation, can we together, with your expertise about your life and your difficulties and your strengths, and then my expertise in treatments, right, decide how we want to move forward together? And then that's where these diagnoses become important and useful again, of we know that DBT, et cetera, can help with BPD, but is not necessary if someone's only difficulty is PTSD. But then if someone does have PTSD symptoms or CPTSD symptoms in the sense of they have trauma, it's getting in the way of their life specifically, then we want to treat that with EMDR, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, some evidence-based therapy for PTSD and trauma specifically, because we know that DBT by itself is not enough for that. Right? We have to do DBT plus PE or DBT plus EMDR if someone has both BPD and PTSD. So again, it's more like the diagnoses help us frame the conversation and get someone connected to the care and like the insurance coverage that they deserve. But it's so much more about who is the person in front of me, and then how can we together help them get through this in the way that's best for them based on what they're struggling with. And then based on, like we said, like what they're struggling with in the sense of not only diagnosis, but do they need a period of skills building in order to do the trauma work or not, right? And that's not based on diagnosis, that's based on the person for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I really struggle with the single versus multiple repeated traumas part because if we take myself for example, and I don't meet the criteria for PTSD anymore, I don't believe. I certainly have at some points in my life, many points for many years, but I've experienced like I've experienced like three uncles who died by suicide. And I know very graphically about the death of those people. I've experienced multiple sexual assaults, right? And those have been really shitty and had a lot of long-term consequences for me. But like, I still don't think about those things as like chronic,
Mm,
repeated traumas. There were multiple experiences of them, but I wasn't subjected to sexual assault reoccurring for years, or like, I'm not going through a suicide of somebody every day or whatever. So, like, you tell me, what are your thoughts about that? Where's the
mhm.
line?
Yeah. My hesitation, so this is where maybe I should flag of like, as a person who doesn't normally diagnose CPTSD and doesn't specialize in that specifically, I'm not sure how a person who does diagnose CPTSD would differentiate between them, or what they would say to that your question. And my thoughts are, I think that this is also getting at what I have seen in my clinical practice that seems to be played out in the research of like the type of trauma or the amount of trauma or the like the way that the DSM differentiates between like how dangerous, quote unquote, something is to like the person's life being trauma or not trauma, how much even that determines what someone's PTSD symptoms are. Like we know that the type of trauma or the amount of trauma does not correlate perfectly with like the amount of PTSD symptoms someone's going to experience, right? And so, and we also know as now, as I said, of like that type of trauma or the amount of traumas doesn't determine which PTSD treatment is going to be most effective for them, from my understanding at least. So for me, that really speaks to the ways that repeated childhood abuse, particularly the way that is captured often by CPTSD, can be so difficult to treat because all of the memories kind of and the trauma experiences mesh together. And the way that trauma is often treated is so like event specific. You can tell me about how it is in EMDR because I don't specialize in that. But in PE and in CPT, other PTSD treatments, we're often looking at like, okay, let's look at this memory and a trauma event and work on that. And then we move on to the next one and we move on to the next one. And often it's not that clean, right? Having experienced an assault one time changes the experience of assault the next time. So, like, they are still related. So, we're not pretending like that's not true, but we can still get at the emotions and thoughts and experiences of one trauma at a time in a way that gets much trickier with chronic child abuse, like caught in that complexity, I think, often in the CPTSD that people talk about, especially lived experience of like, it was just all a shit show, right? And it just all negatively impacted my life and continues to in like sometimes ambiguous ways or sometimes hard to pin down ways. So I feel like I don't know like where to land with that, but those are some of my thoughts about it.
Yeah, and when I think about myself, if I were experiencing symptoms of PTSD and I had to ask myself, is this PTSD or CPTSD? I would say PTSD.
Mm. Oh, can you explain why? Like what does that feel like to you or why do you say that?
I think because I wasn't exposed in a persistent way to the traumas. Like
Mm,
there was lengths of time between the traumas. There was, sometimes some support provided in between the traumas by parental figures and other times not or whatever. But
mm,
and it's funny because my therapist has said to me, like, Sarah, you've experienced so much trauma, but we've never said, Sarah, you look like you experience chronic or complex PTSD, right? So I don't know, but it's like, where's that line? The
mhm,
line is very messy because it's not isolated to one single trauma. There's
mhm,
many traumas that we could choose from if we look at my life and the ways in which they all interact with one another, especially the not wanting to get close to people because it's like, well, you're either going to fucking kill yourself or you're going to hurt me in some sort of physical way. Like, especially when I think about men.
mm.
So in that way, maybe you could consider it complex PTSD, right? I don't fucking know.
Hmm. Yeah, so this is the limit of my knowledge. I'm not sure either. Like maybe someone would say, I feel like it's possible. Someone would say like, oh, the traumas need to be related. I have no idea. People can't who are listening can't see my face. Like I'm very quizzical right now. I'm not sure. But like so childhood abuse is often from the same person across time. War zone is like not the same person, but the same context in which the traumas are happening. And as I said, those are the two often cited like complex trauma examples in the CPTSD field. But I think you're also speaking to like kind of what I said of like your life is one continuous narrative. Your traumas all happen in the same context of your life, and they each impacted the other in terms of how you felt and thought about the world and about yourself and about other people, it sounds like particularly. And so is that like this is where I'm not sure, I'm not totally convinced of the difference of complex versus typical PTSD, especially for folks who have experienced multiple traumas of various sorts, right? Um, yeah, I don't know. And I think these are the questions that folks who feel very passionate about CPTSD are having about like what are the differences and why do they matter? And I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the areas that we don't know the answer to right now.
But I agree with you. Like, well, and I think you're right. And it does, the treatment of CPTSD does get very confusing when we look at PTSD and you look at EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, whatever it is. It is a very structured therapy that focuses on one experience, 8 to 12 sessions. There's
Hmm.
very clear linear steps in how you're teaching and exposing and teaching again how to
Hmm.
process that therapy. But how do you do that when the therapy has been so long over time? You know, it's not isolated to this one or two experiences that you could then say, okay, well, we've been through 8 sessions on this one trauma and your symptoms have greatly reduced. Now let's start again with the next trauma. Well, you can't do that when someone's been exposed to repeated sexual assault. That's not the way that it works.
No, no, no. So, 100%. And in my experience, what it often looks like is not, you don't actually go all the way back to the beginning, first off. You kind of like start in the middle because you have the foundation and you go back through memories. But what often happens is the type of, again, the way that traumas, because it's more about the person's experience of the trauma than the trauma themselves, right? The PTSD symptoms are like that. Like, how am I processing and sitting with what happened to me? And so the work on one trauma memory in CPT specifically, we're talking about now, for example, you're so often working on all of the other memories too, even if you're not addressing it explicitly, right? Because the learning and the emotional reactions and conditionings that you've had from one are often so relevant to the others. So I I am not someone who's gone through CPT as a client. I will say that. So like I take everything I say with a grain of salt in this way. But for my clients who I have gone through CPT with multiple trauma events, it's often like by the time we get to the third or fourth, they're like, oh, this is the same thing. And there's like, so there's that learning from the initial ones that still applies to all of the other ones. And for some people, this is just something that I talk about a lot with DBT, also, so outside of PTSD, of like, there's more work to be done that's more than just trauma exposure, right? Like, more than just addressing the base, like the most intense PTSD symptoms. That's kind of the long-term work that isn't always a part of CPT or stage one DBT, but like, that's a different issue where people are still left with some. I mean, I have experienced trauma as well, and like, you're never you're different forever. Like there is no getting back to the normal or who you were before. And there's like there's a difference in like I can feel like there's an underlying still like stickiness or stuckness related to the trauma, even if my PTSD symptoms are down, right? And I don't think that CPT and PE are the best therapies for that because they're short term and like so specific about PTSD. So there's that balance too. I don't know how EMDR is. Like it's much less structured, right? You can go on long term, or you tell me.
EMDR is pretty highly structured. I don't do it, but
Oh,
from the research that I've done, it generally is like 8 to 12 sessions in one specific event and like very clear steps. So,
interesting.
yeah, I actually just today graduated a client from therapy who's starting EMDR therapy, and I'm like, I'm so fucking excited for you, dude. Like, so
Hmm.
cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and then it
I
gets
think this is one of the limits of the diagnostic thing too, right? Like just because you don't meet diagnostic criteria for BPD or PTSD doesn't mean you're not suffering in some way, right? It's all relative, of course, but that's one of the limits of the diagnoses that I bring up and I think is relevant to this conversation because I think for folks who have experienced chronic trauma, repeated traumas, and or chronic invalidation, like we're talking about BPD now, whether or not they feel like they have PTSD, it takes a long time to feel okay, whatever that means for you, right? You cannot meet criteria for these diagnoses and still want therapy and benefit from therapy or other mental health avenues.
Yeah, and one of the things I think about too is if we think about borderline through the DSM-5, which from a borderline perspective, the DSM-5 makes a lot of sense to me. The DSM-5 TR makes a lot of sense to me in the persistence across the lifespan, whereas we know that PTSD, CPTSD doesn't have to present that way. And I wonder
Mhm.
what your thoughts are about that, like going into quote unquote remission from BPD symptoms being more unlikely than remission from PTSD or CPTSD.
Ooh, I would love to be able to confidently cite research for a question like that. I will say that as a caveat. And it would also make sense to me based on our conceptualizations and our understandings of these diagnoses that it would be like what you're saying. Like that makes sense to me. And I think that is also getting at like what the differences between these diagnoses is trying to capture, right? Like if we can treat the PTSD symptoms, then there can be a return to, again, not normal because what the fuck is that? But like a return to having a completely fulfilling life with no problems beyond the problems that everyone in life experiences. While with BPD, obviously we know remission is possible, right? And this is where you can, I'm sure, speak better than me as someone with BPD. But from what I've heard people describe is you can feel like, oh my gosh, 100%, I do not meet the criteria for BPD anymore. And there'll still be these like sticky points that just feel like you can't get over or will come in waves and get worse at certain points. And maybe you don't meet criteria anymore, but you're definitely kind of beyond what again, a quote unquote typical person would experience and whatever you're going through, which theoretically is different than what it would be like when if PTSD is treated successfully, I would say. Does that make sense or does that like resonate with you? I don't know. What do you think as someone with BPD?
Yeah, that completely resonates with me. And we had this like discussion slash debate like years ago about like is BPD recovery possible? And I kind of
Hmm.
fall into the like you know, I don't it, what stands out to me is that you may no longer meet the criteria for borderline, but how much are you having to use your skills in order to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
if you weren't using your skills, would you still meet the criteria? Whereas with PTSD or CPTSD, that may not, in fact, be the case. You may no longer have to use that same amount of skills and you might not meet the criteria. And like a good example of this, I just met with a client today who I've done therapy with off and on for like 4 years. I love her. She's amazing. And she just finished a 9-month DBT program. So she's back in therapy with me for like maintenance of skills. And she was like, Sarah, I thought it would feel better. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, and we went through the whole like, but you do feel better. It's not as big of a growth as you maybe expected it to be because that's maybe not the way that it is. And like,
Mm-hmm.
what if that can be okay? But you're
Mm-hmm.
still growing. It's still going to get a little bit better over time, and then a little bit more better, and then a little bit more better. And like maybe that can add up to big change. I don't know. We have to like wait and see. But like, don't stop using your skills.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I really like the way that you're describing that about like how you described it to her. That resonates with me with some clients, but also personally, like the mental health journey I've had ups and downs. Hmm, I'm trying to think through this. I'm going to be thinking through this out loud, obviously, because I haven't thought about this exactly. I am thinking about some of the folks I've worked with who are like autistic or ADHD and have BPD, right? And so I think about some of them who maybe don't fit exactly what we're saying in the sense of I don't I think this could apply to someone who's not autistic and ADHD. I think plenty of people with BPD, like that biological sensitivity, right? And reactivity, emotional reactivity that some people are just born with. It's kind of like neurodivergent in that way, right? We wouldn't expect them to, in some ways, like never need skills, right? There's kind of like an inherent need for using skills to cope with life as it exists, especially like current life in an ableist society that has such strict like definitions and expectations for neuronormativity, right? And like emotional control and things like that. But does the fact that someone needs to use skill indicate pathology? You know what I mean? And like I would argue no. But so that's where it gets interesting to me of like, does conscious use of skills, which as an emotionally sensitive person, I feel like I still need to do that quite a lot in order to like maintain my mental health, broadly speaking, and to not act in ways that I view as problematic according to my values. And then for some of my, again, autistic or ADHD clients who are very sensitive in these ways, they can no longer meet criteria for BPD after learning these skills and then maintain a level, a baseline that they would not have been able to maintain before treatment, but they're still going to be more sensitive than everyone around them, or most people around them, and still going to have to be very conscious about taking care of themselves and stress regulation and, problem solving their lives to accommodate their needs, right? I don't know. Does that feel like it fits in the way that you're seeing it, or does that, yeah.
No, I mean that's the thing is it does. And also I see the skills use impacting the pathology from the perspective that I was talking about as well. So it's like it's always where's the line, you know?
Hmm.
And that's where the DSM-5 gets tricky is that we're saying the line is you have to meet criteria if you want treatment because
Yeah.
that's how insurance works. And it's like,
Yes.
well, if we stop looking at mental health treatment from that medical model and we just allow people to access services because that's A, what they want or B, what they need, then we wouldn't be having this discussion.
Yeah, and totally. Yeah. And wouldn't that be great to not have to have this discussion? Okay. That makes sense to me. I mean, this even makes me think about like the neurodiversity movement in general, right? Of like, what a world if even experiencing trauma, we know changes the brain, right? And that person, even someone who's experienced trauma, especially has experienced repeated trauma, like just because they don't meet criteria anymore doesn't mean that they might not continue identifying as neurodivergent, like because of the way that trauma has changed how they feel, how they think, how they interact with the world, right? And so that's again, it's not so much, no matter what the diagnosis is, like to not pathologize a very understandable reaction to what you've been through in your life, whether concrete single trauma, repeated trauma, or chronic invalidation, or whatever is kind of part of a person's developmental history to kind of contribute to BPD. And to not and just to give people the help they need, whatever the diagnosis is, and then using the diagnosis to help make that decision, but more importantly, get them connected to the care that they need because that's the system that we're working in right now, for better or for worse.
Yeah, it's very messy.
You know.
Yeah, I know we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, I worry about triggering people. I just want to come back to like
Mm,
if you listening resonate significantly with CPTSD, I think that's awesome and it's real. We obviously have talked a lot about the differences between
mhm.
complex and regular PTSD, and there's real tangible differences. So if you're listening, I hope you don't feel invalidated by this discussion. We're just kind of like talking through it as two people, but also two clinicians, and it's messy.
Mhm. Yeah, like, so this is like a dialectic, right? Obsessed with those, obviously, as a DBT therapist, just in case folks who aren't familiar. Dialectic meaning two seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time. Like DSM-5 doesn't have CPTSD diagnosis, and most of the, if not all of the CPTSD criteria are captured by the PTSD criteria in the DSM-5 TR. And and so like, is there really a functional difference? Maybe not. And CPTSD is an identity, is a diagnosis, is a community, is like a frame of language or identifier that some people use and find really validating and helpful. Like both of those things can be true, right? And like just recognizing both, I think, is like the important thing, and doing our best as clinicians, as people with lived experience, as human beings in general, to try to find the synthesis to help people create the lives they want to live and reduce suffering for as many people as possible, right? At the end of the day, that's the goal. And so, yeah, like you do you. And like here we are from our lenses talking about what we know and trying to help other people understand themselves in the meantime, too.
Yeah, you definitely sounded like a DBT therapist then, just then. You're like, reduce suffering. I'm like, okay,
Oh, I know.
Marsha.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes forget that it's such a specific language. Reduce suffering. I like at this point, that is like my main value in life. And whether that comes from DBT language or not, that's it, because that's where I'm coming from.
I love it. Well, wrapping up, what's one thing you want people to know about CPTSD?
Hmm. I think it would be coming back to what you just kind of offered as a takeaway too. Like everything is made up. Like in terms of the diagnoses, right? Everyone's made lines at different points. And so CPTSD is real in the sense of the way that it is not only a diagnosis in the ICD-11, but the way that often people talk about. And so to recognize that CPTSD is a thing that's distinct from BPD and from PTSD, it seems, and like the impact of that is unclear. And so it's more about like if CPTSD as a diagnosis resonates with you, find a therapist who resonates with you about how they talk about it and the type of therapy they provide, and hopefully an evidence-based therapy for PTSD, because a lot of those will treat CPTSD too, to be clear, and get the help that you deserve and know that like it is a thing that you can get help with. Yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so the easiest place to find all of me is my website, which is kikifehling.com. But then also on most social media at DBT Kiki.
I love it. And those links will be in the show notes, y'all. My
Thank you.
friend, we have to do this again. I just love talking to you, and I can't wait for people to hear your wisdom.
Yeah, same. Thank you for having me, and I hope this is helpful for folks because it's a tricky area.
Hi, listeners. Thank you for tuning in to the Bold, Beautiful Borderline podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode today. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. That is super helpful for me. It helps us find additional folks who want to listen to the show, want to feel seen, family members who want to learn, and partners who want to understand. If you want to follow along to more than just the podcast, find us on Instagram at Bold Beautiful Borderline, find me at Borderline from Hell, or head over to boldbeautifulborderline.com where there's information, resources, a place to leave a voicemail to be heard on the podcast, which I love, and just general content. All of that information can be found in the show notes. And if you want to get exclusive content, which is bonus episodes, journal prompts, worksheets, all sorts of extra stuff, sometimes videos of me with my hair very crazy with kind of impulsive borderline rants, head over to Patreon and consider becoming a member. That is super helpful with creating content that allows me to destigmatize BPD and all of the other wild mental health struggles that we discuss on the podcast. A huge thanks to everyone who joins on the podcast to share their story and just generally helps keep this thing alive. Especially my friend Corey Evans from the Evergreen Band. He produced and created the music that is the intro and outro for this show, as well as the cover art that was created by my husband, Talon Abbott. Their information is found in the show notes. All of the information discussed in the podcast is purely personal experience. This is not medical recommendations. This is not therapy recommendations. There's no producer for this show. It's all me.